Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for the very kind introduction, and it's a real honor to be here on behalf of National Geographic. Thank you to all the distinguished guests and to all the photo contest winners. It was a real honor to be a judge for this photo contest, and I'm very excited to be here and have a chance to share some of my own photography with you today. What I thought I'd do, I've been photographing many different wildlife subjects around the world over the last 20 to 30 years, but birds have always been a very special passion of mine. And recently I put together a collection of my bird photography from all over the world. And so that's my theme for today, is Bird Planet. It's a photographic journey around the different continents, sharing some of my favorite pictures and the stories behind them. So I want to start out with this image, one of my favorites from Venezuela. These are scarlet ibises. They're flying past and that's the moon up in the upper corner there of this shot. And I made this image on a trip down to South America, to the country of Venezuela, to the Orinoco River, the big river that flows out into the north coast of Venezuela. When I arrived there, I began scouting and trying to figure out, how I was going to get pictures of these ibises, these spectacular birds. And they were basically traveling from their feeding grounds out in the mudflats and coming back to the mangrove forests every evening to roost. So you can see here that there were many birds, there were lots of ibises, but it was a very messy habitat photographically. Kind of a dense mangrove forest and mud on the bottom. How was I going to get close to these birds and make, strong images? Usually when I go into a photo assignment, I have an idea in my mind of what is the image that I want to capture. And I guess the idea that I had when I went on this assignment was I wanted to get close-up shots of the birds feeding from like eye level at the ground. And so I couldn't get close to them from a boat. So I decided, because of when the tide went down and they were feeding on the mud, I couldn't get close enough. So I decided I had to hide close to the trees. So I made a blind, which is a blind or hide, a place to hide and take pictures right next to the mangrove patch of mangroves that you see there. Now, this was only accessible when the tide was high, and so what we did was we built a little platform out of a sheet of plywood, just about a little bit more than 1 by 2 meters in dimensions. And at the time that I was doing this photography, the tide was high during the middle of the day and during the middle of the night. And so, but the good time for photography was a sunrise and sunset. So my solution was I had to spend the night on this platform. So I had the boat come and drop me off here during the high tide when the boat could reach their location. And I took with me a box with my waterproof box with my cameras and a small cooler with some food and water and a pad to sleep on. And my plan was I'll stay here on this small platform, I'll wait for sunset, take pictures at sunset, sleep during the night, and then I'll take pictures at sunrise and then get picked up when the tide comes back up the next day. So the first part of the plan, went very well. The sun started to go down, birds started to arrive, and some of them were landing nearby me and started feeding around my blind there. None of them came as close as I wanted, but I was getting some nice shots. And then the sun set, and I got some beautiful shots of the groups of birds flying, kind of silhouettes as it got darker. There was not enough light to see the colors, but I could still shoot some silhouettes of the birds. And I even started experimenting with like a slow shutter speed when it's getting really dark, just getting artsy and trying different things. And finally, it got dark, and so I lay down. I ate my sandwiches, and I prepared my mattress, my camping pad, and I lay down to get some sleep, wait for the light to come again in the morning. Well, around midnight, I was woken up when the water started rising over my platform. What happened was we miscalculated about the tide cycle. We did not have a good tide chart for that location. And when we went in the daytime to make the platform, we thought it was high tide, but actually the high tide at midnight was higher than the high tide in the daytime. So I ended up, first I had to get up and sit in my chair, and then I was standing up, and this was in the morning. The tide still had not gone out yet, and I'm having to stand on my platform. My gear is all, fortunately, in waterproof cases, but I had a very long night with no sleep because the water was above my platform most of the time. And unfortunately, despite all this effort, I wasn't really satisfied with the picture that I got. I hadn't really gotten the shot that I wanted yet of the scarlet ibises. So the next day I said, okay, I need a new plan. That plan was kind of a failure. Now I'm going to try getting close to them on the mud. So I decided to make a new type of blind. I decided to make like a moving bush, right? I used a truck inner tube, and I put a little platform on it, and I have my camera inside there, and my idea was I can just push this across the mud and then slowly approach the birds, and they will not pay attention to me, right? They'll ignore me because I'm just a slowly moving mangrove bush, right? You can see on the front, there's my lens sticking out. I'm just showing you how this worked. Okay, so see, I look just like a small mangrove bush, and so what I had to do was then I pushed this through the mud. It wasn't very pleasant, but I couldn't stand up because I had to crawl like this and sort of keep my body behind the blind. But it worked because I got close to the birds. I just slowly pushed my blind out toward the birds that were feeding, and I got some pretty nice shots that I was happy with. This bird was sort of bathing in the puddles out there in the mangroves, and flapping their wings to dry off, and got a nice reflection. So I was really happy with these shots. They were a good addition to the story from that location. But really, in terms of capturing the sort of most beautiful shot of these beautiful birds, I still wasn't satisfied because it's just so muddy. The brown mud is just kind of not very attractive, and the daylight, the height, the time when I could get out there at low tide, the light was kind of harsh. So I was still thinking, okay, I can still improve. What else can I do to get, a more dynamic, more interesting artistic shot of these birds? So I kept going back to the boat and shooting the flying birds as they were coming in the evening, back to their roosting sites. And occasionally they came close to my boat, like this pair here. And I thought, this is really nice. It's very simple composition, great colors, red and blue. And so I kept working from the boat, trying to get shots of the birds flying over. And I also noticed that evening it was almost the full moon, and the sun was setting and the moon was still up. And so I had this idea, it'd be cool to get a bird flying past the moon. And so I started to try to line up and see, which birds were coming toward the moon and position my boat so I could have the best chance of capturing those. And this is not that great a shot. The composition isn't very good. A little later, a group of ibises came flying close to the moon, and I was pretty happy with this photo, but the birds are a little too small. The heads aren't really just standing out from the bodies, so it's still not good. And then finally, I got this shot. And this is the whole frame. And of course, it's not perfect, right? There's no such thing as a perfect picture. That's one thing I love about photography, is that there's always room for improvement. No matter how great the photo is, you can always think of some little thing you could have done better. There's no such thing as perfection in photography, but you can always strive for perfection. And of course, I don't have a problem with cropping. And in this case, one of the big problems with this picture is this fourth bird in the bottom left is really distracting and cut off. So, of course, I cropped the picture like this, and this was the final result of from that whole experience. I think it was my favorite image from that trip. and probably one of my favorite portfolio images. And so incidentally, I also, let me just comment on, so what makes this a really strong image? And I think there are a number of things I've already mentioned, like just the beautiful colors, the contrasting of the red and the blue. But one nice thing is just the number of birds. Like 3 is a nice number because your eye moves around between the 3 birds, right? And all their wings happen to be in different positions, which is really nice aesthetically. And the moon just adds that extra something special, right? It's a little surprise, like, what is that? Oh yeah, it's the moon. So something small like the little details like that, they elevate the picture from the ordinary to the extraordinary, So, yeah, I guess kind of my take-home message for the photographers on this kind of situation is, keep working your subject, keep thinking of ideas, and when I first went to the location, I had a idea in my head of I had to shoot down low on the mud, but really the best shot turned to be against the sky, which normally I don't always shoot against the sky, thinking that's going to be a bad background. So keep an open mind and be creative. And so this image, I actually used it on the cover of my most recent book, Bird Planet, which I'm kind of basing this talk around. And you might wonder, well, that's kind of a weird cover because you cut off the bird, but actually what we did was we used it as a wraparound cover. And so it kind of makes you pick the book up and look around the back to see what's going on with the bird around to the back, and then you discover that there's also the moon there. So during this presentation today, I'm going to share a number of stories like that about different images from different parts of the world. And I just want to mention here at the beginning that I have kind of 3 themes that I want to try to convey during this presentation that I hope you take away when you go home today. And one is, I hope to inspire your creativity a little bit so you can think about how you approach your photography or your own creative pursuits and maybe try to think about how you can take things to the next level, right? I also really want to emphasize, ethical photography. It was already mentioned by our editor that's so important with birds is to treat them with respect and make sure that you're not harming birds while you're trying to photograph them, right? And then birds are such great ambassadors for wild places, for nature. People can relate to birds, they're beautiful, and so birds, using your photography for conservation is another theme that I want to touch on today. So just to back up a little bit to tell you how I got started. I began, with a strong interest in nature from when I was a child, and I decided to study biology in school, but I also was really interested in photography early on. And these are a few slides from my very first kind of bird photography from when I was in college. I worked as a research assistant after my first year in college for a professor studying these marsh birds called gallinules and in Michigan, in the United States. And as the first blind, in the upper left, the first blind that I ever made was just a platform to watch one of the nests of one of these gallinules, or these marsh birds, common gallinules. And the quality of these pictures is not that good, but I thought it was kind of fun to show the slides. And you can see the numbers on the slides is roll 16 and 15. So this is actually, of all the slides, rolls of film that I ever took in my life, this is only roll 16 at the beginning of my career. And of course, I ended up shooting many, many thousands of rolls of film, and of course, since the last 20 years, I'm sure over 1 million digital images. But besides a little bit of photography in the United States when I was in college and kind of getting into it, I really developed my kind of serious photography, wildlife photography, actually in Borneo. When I was 25, I went to Indonesia, to the island of Borneo, as a volunteer research assistant on a rainforest project there with a professor from Harvard University. And that was where I kind of pursued my passion for wildlife photography and really got serious about it. And it was a long period of about 10 years between when I first went there as a volunteer and then I kept going back, doing my PhD research there, and doing other projects there, and I just kept working on my photography in probably one of the most difficult environments to do photography, the rainforest. I kept kind of trying to learn and figure out how to do photography in the rainforest. And that's where so that's why this is the kind of really the first chapter in my story, is because that's where I kind of cut my teeth on wildlife photography. The very first day that I remember arriving at this research station in Borneo, deep in the rainforest, had a long journey up a small river by boat to this research camp, and I saw a rhinoceros hornbill, flying over the canopy, way up through the trees. I saw a glimpse of this bird, and I remember thinking, someday I have to get up in the trees, and get pictures of these birds like up in the top of the canopy. And it took me many years of my work there, over my course of my work there, to learn how to do this and to finally get up there. But this image is really the one that kind of helped to kickstart my career with National Geographic, because about 10 years after I first went to Borneo, I published this image in my first article in National Geographic. So let me tell you a little bit about how I made this picture. This is a rhinoceros hornbill, tossing a fig in the air before he swallows it. Of course, the big problem with trying to photograph birds up in the canopy is, like, how do you get up there, right? The trees are 20 to 30, even 40 meters tall. And so I first had to learn how to climb trees safely. And I used a bow and arrow to shoot a fishing line over a tree. Now here I'm already up in a tree. This picture is taken by my friend Mark Moffat, another National Geographic photographer who was doing a story about canopy research. And I start from the ground, and I shoot a line up over a branch. And here I was up in the tree. I was trying to rig a line from one tree to another tree. But I use a bow and arrow like that to shoot a fishing line over a branch, and then I pull a rope up, and then I can climb the rope using ascenders, using mountaineering equipment, where I can wear a harness and use ascenders to inchworm my way up the rope. Now you can see I look a lot younger in this picture. This is a really old picture, but I'm still doing this. I'm still staying fit and doing this. So just to prove it, and here's a picture of me from just the last year or so in Borneo. And now my wife's very happy. Now I even wear a helmet, in case the branches are falling on from above or whatever. So safety first. But climbing trees in the rainforest is not always kind of exciting and glamorous. Sometimes it's kind of miserable. I should be making a habit of getting caught in the rain while I'm making blinds. So this was in Thailand a couple of years ago. I was building a platform. You can see there I already built the floor, and I was going to film hornbills, actually, for another project for National Geographic on helmeted hornbills. And I climbed up there next to a fruiting tree, and I was building this platform in the afternoon, and I really wanted to finish making my blind, putting the cover on so I could hide, because I wanted to come back the next morning before it got light, so I could start filming the hornbills. So I didn't want to give up and go, even though I saw the rain coming, but I was like, I'm just going to wait. I'm going to get wet anyway. I'm just going to wait for the rain to pass, and then I'll finish making the blind. And so making a good blind, or hide as it's sometimes called, is so useful for wildlife photography, right? If I was just up there in the open in the trees, the hornbills would never come close to me. But if I hide like this really well, and I hope you can see my eyes over there, in the middle of that camouflage, this is a very simple blind where I'm just, does everybody see me? I'm right here. Okay. My lens sticking out there in the bottom. So if you hide really well like this, then the birds, will come, or they won't notice you, and they come close. And on that particular tree, I had several hornbills one day came and landed all around me and started feeding. And so let me show you a couple of the images that led up to that, the best shot that I got. So, here I had a bird that's pretty close to me. He's foraging, but it's not a very great shot. It's kind of a documentary shot of the bird. Then he picked a fig, and the photo's getting better, but still it's, not that dynamic. I knew that the hornbills like to toss the fig in the air and sort of soften them up before they swallow them. So I was waiting for him to do that, and as soon as he started to do it, I tried to time my shot to catch the fig in midair. Right? So people often ask me, what's the difference between a good photo and a great photo, or something that will get published in National Geographic? It could be the very small things, right? So this photo is very similar to this one, but it's like night and day. It's a completely different shot because I captured like a decisive moment. It's like I captured a frozen moment in time that draws your attention, right? I mean, there are other nice things about this image as well, like the relation between the foreground and the background is very nice. You can see where you are in the environment, but it's not too busy. The color contrast between the orange and red and the green is very beautiful, and so on. So there's a number of things that, help to make this a nice image. But really, if you can capture a decisive moment of bird behavior, and in an aesthetically beautiful scene, then that will really make for a strong image. So, like I mentioned, this ended up being the lead image in my first article in National Geographic back in 1997, which was really kind of a culmination of my PhD project studying strangler figs and birds in Borneo. And after that, I started to become a regular contributor to the magazine, proposing other stories and getting assignments and so on. But that was one of the keys to getting started. And that was all done in a national park called Gunung Palung National Park, where my wife continues to work on her orangutan project. And so I continue to go back there and come up with stories. There's always so many stories to tell in the rainforest. And one thing that I wanted to do recently, this was a project I started in 2018 with a grant from National Geographic Society, was to try to use camera traps or trap cameras to capture images of some of the species that are really hard to see, that we would never see on our own, or we could never photograph directly because they're either nocturnal or just extremely shy. And so camera trapping is very equipment intensive and also I need a lot of help. So this is my team I worked with. My son Russell, actually on the left, who's also a photographer, and my Indonesian friends Darmawan, Huayu, and Herman, a great crew, and we scouted around the forest looking for sites to set up a series of these cameras. And this is the equipment just for one camera setup. So it's a waterproof box with a SLR inside, 3 flashes with waterproof tubes to keep them from, because everything has to survive the rainforest of Borneo, which is like very wet, right? And so, and then you have like a beam trigger system, wireless control. It's a very complicated and lots of things that can go wrong. But when you get it all set up, you have to find a place like this. This is an example where we chose a fallen tree over the river, which we thought animals might use as a natural bridge. And so we set up the camera here, tested it all out, and then we would leave it, and just leave it for a couple of weeks, and then come back every couple of weeks, change the batteries, check the memory cards, and so on. And here is one of the shots that we got from that log that you just saw there. This is a really rare bird that's hard to see on photograph. It's called the buffy fish owl, and it hunts fish, as the name implies, and so probably what he's doing is he landed on the log here to, looking down at the river below, and just was walking along the log when he triggered the beam, the infrared beam that took the picture. So that was one of the exciting bird images that we got with this camera trapping. Another species that I really wanted to photograph for many years is the great Argus pheasant, and you see one here. This is the male great Argus pheasant, and they are one of the biggest birds in the ground level in Borneo, but they're extremely hard to see. They're so shy that in 30 years of going to Borneo, I've only seen one once with my own eyes. But we could find their display arenas. They clear the leaves from and sticks. They leave some leaves, but they kind of clean an area. They find a little clearing, and they go there, and then they call. And we set up our cameras on these courts or arenas, these dancing grounds of the Argus pheasant, hoping to capture images of the male, spreading his feathers into his courtship display. And here he is calling. But the thing is, Unlike some birds that keep coming back to the same display site, like birds of paradise, that keep coming back like every day, these birds, they were very frustrating because they did not come back every day. They would have a nice clear arena, and they would not come back for months sometimes. And then all of a sudden they would come for every day for a week, and then they would not come again. So we didn't have too much success during the first 2 years, but we learned a lot about where their courts were. And another project came up with the BBC. I was asked about filming a sequence for the BBC documentary called The Mating Game, about different mating strategies in different animal species. And the Argus pheasant is obviously one of the most interesting ones. So I got another chance for another 1 year plus of camera trapping for the BBC. And so we continued our efforts, and here we captured this bird doing a display to this stick. This branch fell down on the ground, and he came to this arena, and he just decided to do a practice display. So there you see him starting to open his feathers. Now, you might have thought those long feathers were his tail feathers, but actually, those are his wing feathers. They're the wing feathers from the what we call the secondary feathers, not the flight feathers at the end, but the ones that are kind of along the inner part of the wing. And you can see here is what the display looks like when he completely fans it out. He snaps it open in a sudden movement to create this dazzling display of eye spots. And finally, we actually got him not just displaying to a stick, but we actually got him displaying to a female. And the female stands there like mesmerized while the male pops open this incredible display. And that was one of my kind of, goals for a long time, to get a picture of the Argus pheasant. So that was an exciting highlight. All right, well, now I'm going to jump from the rainforest of Borneo to Japan. Actually, I was born in Japan, and I lived there throughout my childhood, with some trips back and forth to the States. My parents were American, obviously, but they were missionaries and professors working there in Japan. And so I really developed my initial love of nature and the outdoors, exploring the outdoors, outdoor adventure in the mountains of Japan. Here's the moon setting over the Japan Alps. And so once I became a regular contributor to National Geographic and I was proposing ideas, I had this idea to do a story about wildlife in Japan, because people don't associate wildlife with Japan too much, but yet there is a real there's a lot of beautiful wildlife in Japan, and especially up in the northern island of Hokkaido, where I decided that I would focus on the birds especially that are spending winter in Hokkaido. I thought that the winter landscape would provide a great background for beautiful photography. And so I did this article about the winter wildlife in Hokkaido. It includes these whooper swans that are wintering there. They breed up in the Arctic, up in Russia, but they come in winter in Japan, where they just need open water, and there are many lakes that have hot springs flowing into them so they don't freeze in the winter. So this is one of the roosting sites early in the morning in a lake called Lake Kushado. There are also beautiful stellar sea eagles, one of the biggest eagles in the world, that also winter along the coast. They follow fishing boats and go out and fishing among the icebergs and ice floes around Hokkaido in the winter. But the most famous bird from Japan in the winter that I really had an interest in photographing is the red-crowned crane. And if you just, do a Google search about red-crowned cranes in Japanese art, you'll find many examples of beautiful paintings from the 1700s and 1800s and earlier. And the cranes are of course in not just Japanese but other Asian cultures are really symbols of love and longevity and good fortune. They have a fabled lifespan of living 1,000 years, and so I wanted to figure out how can I capture an image of the crane that will evoke that kind of feeling, that kind of emotion. I especially like this painting by Okyo from 1770, with these cranes in flight. And I thought, that'd be great to capture something like that. So I was kind of studying these Japanese art pieces before I went on the assignment. So once I was in Hokkaido, I was looking around for, scouting locations, and this is one of my favorite locations. It's a place called the Setsuri River. It's a beautiful, in the early morning, the birds are roosting there because the river doesn't freeze, because again, it's fed by hot springs. It's safe from predators there are foxes around and stuff, and they stand in the water so that that they're safe at night. And in the early morning, when the sun's just rising and it's really cold and the mist is coming up from the water, it's beautiful to photograph. I really like this image. There are all these layers kind of going back into the distance, these diagonal lines, and that one bird in the middle with the open wings that kind of draws your attention. This is another one of my favorite shots that was published as a 2-page spread in the Geographic. This one bird kind of separated himself from the rest of the group. That kind of it gives you a point of attention in this beautiful scene. But this wasn't quite the shot I was looking for, in terms of I wanted to get some shots in flight and sort of capture that flying crane. So I tried photographing them in, beautiful sunny days, and they looked great against the blue sky, but it wasn't, really capturing that mood, that feeling that I wanted. I also tried experimenting with slow shutter speeds, like this shot, kind of get that artsy blur look. This is okay, but again, it wasn't quite what I wanted. And then a big snowstorm came one day, and I went out in the snowstorm, and the cranes just looked beautiful in the snow. I saw, this is the atmosphere that I need to get the right atmosphere for my shot. So I kept going back to the location where the cranes were hanging out whenever it was snowing. I was driving on the snowy roads in Hokkaido. It was crazy, but I'd get to the location and got some really nice shots of these pairs. The cranes, they mate for life, and even though this was still winter, like February, they're already begin their kind of courtship bonding behavior for the spring mating season. So they're singing a duetting song here in the snow. It's really beautiful. And then one day, it was snowing like so hard. And one also thing that I thought was kind of interesting is, this is a popular photographic subject, and there were many Japanese photographers there, and many days. But when it was snowing really hard, I was like the only one there, And one day, when it was just snowing so hard and I was getting really wet with the snow, but finally some cranes came flying in, and I managed to capture this shot, which, for me, was the kind of shot I was after. I have the kind of soft snow background, and the crane just in a really nice position coming in for a landing, that I was able to freeze that moment. And so this was my favorite image from that whole trip. And one thing that kind of really made me convinced that I had sort of lived up to my expectations was I was actually giving a presentation like this in Japan a few years ago, and I showed this image, and the editor of the Japanese National Geographic, he told me that, he said, this image would look right at home on the wall of a Zen monastery, And so I felt like I had succeeded then with this shot to capture the spirit of Japanese wildlife with this crane image. And looking back at Okyo's painting, I was really amazed, actually, at how good of an observer he was, like how realistic his, he didn't have photography. He just had to see the birds in the wild and paint them. But, being a really good observer of nature is such an important skill for photographers and painters. And he obviously was really good at, making a mental image of what the birds, will look like when they're flying in and coming in for a landing. So I was really struck by that, and just kind of brought home the message that, you got to really be a good observer. All right, let's jump to another snowy place, Antarctica. Now, I'm more of a tropical specialist when it comes to National Geographic magazine stories. I've done a lot of stories in the tropics, but I've had the chance to go to Antarctica quite a few times, I think about 6 times now, with National Geographic's program on their Lindblad expeditions, on their cruise ships, small expedition cruise ships, and I get to go along as a photography instructor and teaching wildlife photography. And Antarctica is obviously an amazing place for wildlife photography and for bird photography. Of course, penguins, like you see this group of Adelie penguins climbing up on this amazing iceberg here. Penguins are, the obvious subject that everybody wants to photograph when they go to Antarctica. So my challenge was, well, how do I try to make like a unique image of a penguin? Something that hasn't been seen before a million times. And so like when we visited a colony like this, there's so many penguins everywhere, it's hard to think about how to make an interesting shot. But this is an island called Devil Island off the Antarctic Peninsula in the Weddell Sea. And when I arrived there one time, I thought, okay, I'm not going to go walking around in the colony trying to find an interesting photograph. I'm just going to sit right here on the beach, right where the action was, where the birds are going in and out of the water. So the birds are going out to go feed, and then they're coming back to bring the food to feed the chicks. And the really interesting behavior that they do when they're swimming toward the shore is called porpoising. See the bird here? So they're just like a dolphin or porpoise. They jump completely out of the water. Of course, they have to take a breath, but also they're doing that so they can see ahead, like where they land, where they're aiming for, so they can navigate. So they leap out and they get a lot, And so this has been photographed, of course, many times, and I photograph from the side is easier. But I had this idea, like, I want to try to catch a penguin leaping, straight toward me, coming into the frame. It seemed almost impossible, but I had an idea about how to do it. And I actually managed to get this shot right here by sitting there on the beach for like an hour or more. And I'll tell you what I did, how I got the shot. So I would see the penguins coming from far away, and they're every once in a while they're jumping out of the water and disappearing, and then a few seconds later they jump out of the water. So when I saw some penguins coming toward me, I would guess, just completely guess, where they're going to come out of the water next. I would focus there, and I would just start pushing the button. This is thanks to digital photography. It doesn't matter. And then I shot thousands of pictures with no birds, just water. Okay, but then one time I pointed it at the right place, and here's the sequence. So first he comes out, he's not in focus, but then he comes into focus and then drops down back into the water. This is 12 frames per second, on a Canon camera. So this was the final shot, and I was shooting a little bit wide, and of course, so I cropped in to get this version of it. Right? And if you have enough resolution, that's one good thing about our modern cameras. We have enough resolution sometimes. If you need to crop in a bit to make the image work, there's nothing wrong with that. So in this case, this was a sometimes we call it like the spray and pray technique. You just you have an idea, you just fire a lot of shots and hope that you'll get the bird in focus in the right position. But I had to have the idea first and be willing to keep trying it to get the shot. But I was very happy with that, and it's my favorite penguin shot that I got from many trips to Antarctica. If you look closely, I think one thing that's really fascinating is that he's completely covered in a film of water. Like you can see, he brought the water with him, and he has this layer of water on his body, and he's so round from the front, right? He's like a torpedo. All right, we're making another jump to another continent. And when I was doing an assignment about hornbills for National Geographic many years ago, these are hornbills in the foreground, these really interesting birds called ground hornbills. I needed a picture to introduce the story, and of course I wanted people to know this is Africa. So what better way to make it immediately obvious that you're in Africa than to get a zebra in the background? So it took a long time to get the zebra to cooperate, be behind the hornbills. But eventually I got this shot. So Africa has a lot of fascinating birds. And my first trip there, I was focusing on the hornbills that you see on the left, these really amazing birds with these huge eyelashes. There are other cool birds like guinea fowl. But probably one of the most iconic birds of the African savannas would be the vultures, right? This is a griffon vulture. And so I had the idea it'd like to be cool to capture a really great vulture image. And I had a few chances on some different safaris that I've been on to photograph vultures. And you could get these kind of shots, kind of gruesome shots of them eating a carcass. But I mean, it's good behavior, but it's not like a beautiful photograph, right? How do you make a beautiful photograph of a vulture? Well, one day, we were just kind of driving back to our camp. There was not much happening. It was a late afternoon. And I saw this vulture all by himself, just resting in a tree with his wings open a little bit. He's trying to cool off. And this is the first picture I took, because I had a big lens on. And I thought, okay, well, that's not that interesting a picture. Maybe I looked a little more carefully, and I zoomed out. And I thought, okay, actually this tree is really interesting. It's a lot more interesting if I include more of the tree in this frame. It's becoming a bit more artistic. And also over here, there's kind of like a symmetry between the vulture and this branch on the lower left. In fact, there's even like a vulture head over there, that I put in that circle. So this was getting better, but then I realized, actually, this whole tree is really beautiful. I need to back off even more. Unfortunately, the vulture was just sitting there. So I had plenty of time to try different compositions. And when I backed out even further and included much more of the tree, now we have like a natural, several things, interesting things going on in terms of the composition, right? We have kind of a frame with the tree on either side. We've got the kind of symmetry of the bird up in the, kind of rule of thirds position, this other kind of clump of branches there. And it's just a much more interesting composition than just like a close shot of the bird. So sometimes you have to sort of back up and think about, getting the bird as big as possible in the frame is not always the solution for making a better bird photograph, right? Including more of the surroundings can sometimes make for a much stronger picture. So this was my favorite vulture image so far. All right, as we jump around to different continents, I'll share a few images from Australia. Australia is an amazing place for birds. They have so many interesting species, including some of the birds of paradise. This is one of the birds of paradise called the magnificent riflebird, calling from a branch. And then when he does his display, he opens his wings up and he flashes his head back and forth rapidly, showing off this blue color on his neck. Amazing bird. But Australia also has the bowerbirds, these really curious birds that are building these structures to attract female and decorating them, right? In this case, this is the satin bowerbird, and he decorates with blue objects. His favorite color is blue. And he even uses blue feathers from another bird, a parrot species. So imagine like a bird is using a different bird species feathers for decorations. It's kind of quite a concept, right? And this bird even paints. So you see his bill. He's got a bunch of brown material on his bill. He has a certain plant that he chews up in his beak, and he paints the inside of the avenue of this bower. You see how it's kind of shiny and wet looking on the left side there? So he's rubbing this brown paint on the inside of the bower. And for some reason, the female bowerbirds must like a painted bower. And so just fascinating behaviors of these Australian birds. There are also so many interesting parrots in Australia. There's an incredible diversity of parrot species. This is the largest parrot, called the palm cockatoo, feeding on beech almond fruits here. With that huge bill, they can crack open hard seeds. So I photographed a number of the beautiful parrots in Australia. These are Eclectus parrots, males, they're fighting over that nest entrance. There's a female inside. And in this species, the males kind of fight over the right to provide food to the female, and the female chooses her mate based on who's the best provider. So the males are actually fighting over the opportunity to serve the females. And this is another parrot species called the gala that feeds on seeds on the ground. So just incredible diversity of parrots, all different colors. But I want to tell you a little bit more about this picture, because this is one of the main targets that I went to Queensland for. This is a critically endangered parrot called the golden-shouldered parrot. There's less than 2,000 left in the world. And one of the reasons is that they live in a very small area. Their home range is like a tiny area of the Cape York Peninsula in Queensland. And why do they have such a small range, even though it's not a big developed area? But it is impacted by cattle ranching, but the main reason that their range is so limited is that they only build their nests in these termite mounds. So these strange towers are built by insects, by termites, out in this savanna woodland habitat. And this one species of parrot, the golden-winged parrot, only makes its nests in these termite mounds. It has a relationship with the termites. It carves out a hole in the termite mound. And so it's critically linked to this habitat. And there's that hole right there is a nest. And so to photograph this bird, it's a really endangered bird. I don't want to disturb it, especially from breeding, right? There are only 2,000 left. I work closely with the local conservation team that's working to monitor the birds in this area. And they gave me good guidance about, okay, how close I can put my blind, what's a safe distance, and so on. And this is a very dark video because it's taken before it got light in the morning. But this is me setting up my camera before the birds wake up in a little time lapse. And I have this blind that kind of shaped like a termite mound. See, so I was pretending to be a termite mound. And then from inside my blind, I had a view of that nest tree. And I started photographing the birds. And when it got light, the sun came up, and the male arrived. He's perching on he would perch on different termite mounds, and then he flew into the nest. And from my first vantage point, this is the shot that I got, which I was not that happy with because of it turned out that from this angle, I chose this angle because I wanted to see the nest hole really well. But it turns out almost all the shots, the male's wings are blocking his head. So I had to make adjustments. I had to move my blind the next day to a different angle, and eventually I got this. I kind of pre-imagined this shot, that from this angle what it would look like, pre-focused, and just waited for the bird to come flying in and captured the shot the moment as he's arriving. So, I just want to especially emphasize here, I think it's really valuable to photograph endangered species or poorly known species, because otherwise, how are people going to know about them and care about them and want to protect them, right? So photography is a really important tool, but again, we have to be really sensitive that we aren't negatively impacting these birds that we want to save or we want to help save. And I always, give my images to the conservation groups that I'm working with. Even if I'm doing a geographic story, I can share. They don't mind if I share the images later with the conservation groups so they can use the pictures in their own media and help to promote conservation through photography. All right, so there's a few shots from Australia, and now for the kind of final chapter of the presentation here, I'm going to move up north from Australia into the big island of New Guinea. So New Guinea is one of my favorite places. It's a really wild place. It's the second biggest island in the world, right after Greenland, and it has still 80% of its forest intact. So it's really important for global, carbon mitigation, for keeping that forest and not cutting it down, to retain all that carbon there. And it's a place that I kept going back to for birds of paradise. So starting in 2004, I started going to New Guinea to photograph birds of paradise for the Geographic, and that led to like an 8-year project where I did several articles and a book and a film and managed to photograph all 39 species of this remarkable group of birds, which is summarized in this one slide here this is from back in 2012, when I completed like all the birds of paradise that were known at the time. And whenever I give talks about the birds of paradise, people always ask me, well, how do you know there's only 39? Are there any more? Could there be any more in this vast island of New Guinea? And usually we say, well, no, I don't think so. It's been pretty well explored. But I want to tell you a story about this bird. So this is a superb bird of paradise. And maybe you've seen this video before, or one like it. This is one of our old videos from my colleague Ed Scholes. So this is one of the craziest bird displays in the world, right? The superb bird of paradise. He's like a bouncing smiley face, dancing around this female. Well, this bird is known to live in the mountains of New Guinea. Here's a map of the big island of New Guinea. And you see all that dark green across the middle. Those are the mountain ranges, and that's where that bird is found, all down throughout those higher elevations. But I had been going to a different mountain range that you see up there in the upper left. It's called the Bird's Head Peninsula, and you see how that's separated from these other mountains. And there's superb bird of paradise is there. This is the bird that I photographed in what's called the Bird's Head Peninsula in the mountains. They're called the Arfak Mountains, in the far western part of New Guinea. We photographed this bird, and we thought it was the same as the other one. But we did notice that the females looked a little bit different. And this was documented in the bird books that it was a subspecies of the superb bird of paradise. That the one on the left is the female from the Arfak Mountains, and on the right is the female from the main species, the eastern species. And we realized that, hey, nobody had actually filmed or photographed the Arfak Mountain form displaying. Like, we didn't know what the display looked like. Was it the same as the other one, the round, bouncy, smiley face? Or was it maybe possibly a little bit different? So we made an expedition to go into deep into these Arfak Mountains to try to find a display site of this species. And they're one of the hardest display sites to find because they don't come to it every day like some of those birds of paradise that every morning they're at their display tree. This one, you can hear them calling up in the trees, but they don't display up in the trees. They actually display on a fallen tree like this. And so my colleague Ed, who is an ornithologist at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, he is really good with bird calls. We went into the forest and he heard a superb calling from this area. So we went here and we found this log, and we thought, okay, this looks like a perfect log. This could be the display site. So I first put a small GoPro camera there, like in a time-lapse mode with a big battery, so it would take pictures like all day long. We left it there, and then I checked the camera that night, and sure enough, there was a little black bird like on the log sometime during the day. So I'm like, I knew that was a display site. So what we did then is at the other end of this log, we built a blind. We built a blind with our local guides, covered it with palm leaves, and then we began the long wait inside the blind to try to film the bird actually coming down to display. And I'm shooting on a movie camera here. My partner, Ed, is playing video games on his iPad. No, actually, he's controlling the remote cameras because we had like 2 other cameras that were mounted at different positions that he could control from the iPad. So he actually was also working. And finally, the bird came. And I started recording the video, and he started doing a practice display, and he lifted up his cape. And as soon as he did this, we realized, hey, wait, that shape is different. Look, here's the comparison. The right side is the one that I showed you first from the eastern form. It's oval shape, whereas this form on the left has like a crescent shape. So that surprised us, but also when we actually got a shot with the female, we saw that his also behavior was different. He didn't bounce up and down like the other one. He kind of glided around the female in a circle, whereas this one, remember, is really bouncy. All right? So okay, these are clearly different birds, not the same bird at all. So returning to the question was, is this a new species? And it turned out that at the same time that we were documenting this different behavior, how different the behavior was, some other researchers were using DNA to look at the different bird of paradise populations and other birds from New Guinea to look at, study their relationships based on their genetics. And they also concluded, like, okay, this subspecies is so different. It should be its full species. So in 2018, we published a paper that demonstrated that this western form of the superb bird of paradise is a unique species. So it was like the 40th bird of paradise. So that was pretty exciting to be the first one to photograph what turned out to be like a new species of bird of paradise. And that was just a really exciting culmination of all my efforts of going so many years to New Guinea to photograph these crazy birds. All right, I'm going to wrap up with a story about one more location, one more bird species. And this was one I did during the Bird of Paradise project because I wanted to follow in the footsteps of this author, Alfred Russel Wallace, a famous British naturalist from the 1800s, who explored the Malay archipelago, which is now Indonesia, that whole region of Malaysia, Indonesia. He spent 8 years exploring this region, and one of his main goals was to see birds of paradise. And he was the first European naturalist to see them in the wild and write about, describe their behavior, their displays, and their courtship. Because before him, lots of dead bird specimens had reached Europe, and had been described by scientists, but they didn't know what they actually did with those, what their actually behavior was. And so I wanted to go back to the same island where he went, which is called the Aru Islands in south of New Guinea. And I went there to try to find the same species that he first described there. It's called the greater bird of paradise. And when I got there, I realized that I was looking up from the ground against the sky. I really wanted to get up in the canopy. It's one of the species I really had to be up there in the trees. And the local men who were the landowners there, they had now stopped hunting and were trying to encourage people to come to see the birds, but they also knew how to hunt the birds. And when I told them that I wanted to climb up in the trees and make a platform, make a blind to photograph, they insisted on building it for me. They said that, they asked me, how are you going to do it? And I said, well, I have this camouflage cloth. I'll just hang this over some branches and I'll make a little platform. And they said, oh, that's not going to work. The birds won't come if you use that stuff. They said that you have to follow a certain protocol, certain customs in order for the birds to come. And this is what they learned from their grandfathers who hunted these birds. And so I said, okay, well, if you want to help, that's fine. I'll go along with your local, methods, right? And so I climbed the tree with ropes. I used my bow and arrow, and I climbed up there with ropes. But they just free climbed up there. They just climbed up from one tree to the next. The tree we were in was so big, too big to climb. But they climbed 2 other trees. They climbed to one tree and crossed over. Climbed another tree, crossed over, and got up here about 25 meters from the ground. And so then they built me this little platform. I wanted to be up there to supervise and make sure I had the right view, the right viewpoint. And so when they're making the floor, I said, well, this is kind of small. I need a bigger floor because they're going to bring up a tripod and everything. And they said, no, you can only put 12 sticks on the floor or the birds won't come. And I said, okay, well, then we just have to spread them out a little bit more. And then they were tying everything together with vines and just using, and I said, well, I have lots of extra rope. We can use rope to tie everything together. And they're like, no, if we use rope, the birds won't come. We have to use vines. So they built this, they had this method. They built this entire structure only using natural materials, the local poles, the local vines, and the local palm leaves. And it was very beautiful when they finished. Much more beautiful than my blinds, so I understand why the birds, they don't mind this structure up in the canopy. So, so the next morning after we finished building this, I climbed up, in the dark, early in the morning, and get in there. Of course, we built this in the middle of the day when the birds are not there. They're only coming in the early morning, right? So I climbed up in the dark, and I got into the blind, and I started seeing the birds coming, and it was amazing. There were 2 males with adult plumage. There were some young males and females flying around. I was able to get, change lenses and get close-ups. So for several days, I went up here, every morning, and I tried different things, catching different shots, capturing the behavior of these amazing displays. I got still photo video and still photographs like this where you can see the female inspecting these two males doing a special pose called the flower pose. I get beautiful tight shots to show the beauty of the birds. But the whole time I was also thinking, as I'm shooting all these shots with my telephoto lens from my blind, I'm getting these beautiful images, and birds of paradise are all about beauty, but then I also thought, how can I show these birds, in the environment? The environment's so important, and I always had this idea in the back of my head during the whole Bird of Paradise project that sometime I wanted to get, a wide-angle shot of a bird in the foreground with the whole rainforest behind. And I realized that this location, because this was up on a hill, and these birds had a pretty open tree where they were displaying, I realized, okay, this is the place I can do that. So I climbed up into the tree that they were displaying in after they left.
All right. Now here's the lek right here.
Those are the branches they were using.
Here. This is the main display perch and the secondary perch.
So it's an awesome location.
And there's my blind over there.
That's where I was shooting from.
And right here.
Well, here this was not the first time I went up there. I'd already hid this camera up there. I actually spent several days, first with a GoPro, then going up to a SLR.
Microphone, pocket wizard.
So what I did was, I hid this camera inside these leaves, which are from the same tree. It had big leaves, so I as you saw, I kind of stitched it closed. I hid the camera in these leaves, very close to the birds, only 2 meters away from the birds. And I had a cable. This was 2010 technology, so I couldn't have good wireless. I had to run a cable, and it couldn't reach the ground, so I had to ring the cable to the other blind over there. And so in the early morning, before it got light, I had to climb 2 trees. First, I climbed this tree, put up my camera onto the mount, and connect the cable, go back down, climb up the other tree, carry my laptop, open up my laptop inside the blind, and connect to the camera. And then just hope that everything's going to work and that the weather's going to be good. But after about a week of trying all these experiments, finally one morning, everything's working. And the birds came. So first I started shooting some video. So the behavior was awesome, but as a photographer, I was just thinking I need the light to come out. I need more light. I need the sun to come out. And so a few minutes later, all of a sudden, the sun popped out from behind a cloud, and I switched the camera over to still photography mode, and I got this picture. So this sun finally popped out, and I captured this sort of dream shot that I've been imagining, of the rainforest with the bird of paradise in the foreground and this beautiful scene behind. And I'm really happy to say that this image, besides being used in National Geographic and so on, it also was used by a local conservation campaign when some kind of corrupt Indonesian officials tried to take away this forest from the local landowners and turn it into a sugarcane plantation a few years ago. They asked me if they could use this picture as part of their campaign to bring attention to this, and they did a big campaign across Indonesia about this exploitation there, and they managed to block this plantation coming in and taking out this forest. And so it's just an example of how a photograph can make a difference in protecting habitat, right? And photography is so important in that way. So this is my closing shot, and I hope that from this presentation you've gotten a little inspiration, maybe for your own photography, maybe gotten some ideas about how to get creative and kind of just keep pushing for always trying for that better shot. I hope I've also conveyed that I feel really strongly that we need to not disturb the birds while we're trying to photograph them, respect the wildlife, and it's never worth having a negative impact in order just to get a picture, right? And you always end up with better pictures if you've let the birds do their thing naturally, do their natural behavior, and photograph them doing that. So, and finally, I hope that you're also inspired to think about how your own photography, for all you photographers out here, how your own photography can also, have an impact. Whether you have a global audience or if your audience is just your family and friends, sharing your pictures of birds and wild places and other wildlife can make a difference because it's so important that we educate people and inspire people to care about nature. So, thank you very much.